A friend of mine that I was with this week, we were doing some trainings at La Paloma in Memphis, and her husband is one of the former presidents of Sloan School of Management at MIT, and she was talking about how he went to southern Florida to raise money and met with one of the donors who had about 300 million was his worth, and sat down with him and said, you know, you need to understand, I only have 300 million. Only. And if I'm going to live in this community of Palm Beach, I have to give locally, and I've got to watch my money because I'm not going to have enough until I retire. 300 million. Now, we all laugh, you know, because as therapists, we're never going to get 300 million. But it's true. It has nothing to do with the figure involved. It has to do with the treadmill of seeking more and more and more and more. And it satisfies for a while, but the minute you achieve that level, the bar goes up. It's not enough to have a bestseller, you got to have another one. It's not enough to have a show that goes on Broadway, you've got to have a whole series of them. You name it, whatever it is, it's got to be something more. And when it's not more, the distress is very real, and the shame is very real. And it's because you're looking for validation outside yourself, and the ability to self-validate. That shame-based trauma has really destroyed the ability to feel okay because it is what you want to do. Strong sense of self fails to develop out of that invalidating environment. Principles of self-validation. My thoughts and feelings are as legitimate as other people's, regardless of their position of authority, experience, age, and assertiveness. I do not have to judge my behavior as right or wrong, good or bad. It just can be. I deserve the same respect as any other person. My dreams and hopes are valid simply because I have them and do not deserve to be ridiculed by either myself or others. The ridiculed part by myself is the important part there. Because I think what many of us do in very sophisticated ways is ridicule our own dreams. I'll give you an example, and some of you may know. How many of you ever tried to write? Like write something, okay. And some of you probably have and been successful at it. Well, and I've written some too, but there is nothing more, there's nothing more difficult than when you stare at the empty screen, right? I mean, the tyranny of the empty screen. And then you start writing, okay? And then you get on a roll, and you write, and you write, and you write. You write like 3 or 4 pages. And then you take a break, you go to bed, it's the next day, next week you come back to it, and you read it, and you think, what was I thinking? I can't believe I wrote that, right? And you thought it was good stuff yesterday. And now it's like, oh my God, I wouldn't send that out, right? It's that ridiculing your own dream. It's that inability to self-validate, and it really comes up in those creative pursuits. When we finally give ourselves permission to go out and do something creative, and then we come back and the editor in our head kicks in and says, I wouldn't do that if I were you. That doesn't look quite right. That's not up to the standard. So what do? You go back and you erase it all and you rewrite it, and then you come back the next day and that didn't any good either, and you get through this cycle, and ultimately you get yourself so tied in a knot, and it's so painful to you that you finally stop because it's not worth it. The inability to self-validate. It's legitimate for me to revise my feelings, thoughts, and behaviors at any time. This is really important because a lot of times we think because we felt one way about a person, about a thing, about a job, that somehow we have to stay consistent with that we have to hold that if we change our feelings, we look crazy. And that really is a form of invalidation. The ability to give yourself permission to say, well, that was when I had information then, that was yesterday, that was based on that situation, and it is okay for me to revise the way I feel and feel differently. Self-validation, and a really strong sense of self-validation, is comfortable and validating with feelings as they evolve and change. My self-respect is not dependent on my achievements, my status, or my relationships. Okay. The failure of self-validation to develop the self-validation deficit is a direct result of shame-based trauma. Self-validation is the only way we know our true self. Self-validation is an absolute necessity to experience passion, purpose, and contentment. Excuse me. Okay. So shame says, I apologize, this is a bit small to see, but who I am is flawed and unlovable. Self-validation says I'm deserving of love and acceptance. Shame says my feelings are unacceptable. Self-validation says my feelings are as legitimate as anybody's. Shame says my dreams are foolish and not worthwhile. And self-validation says I have the right to treasure and honor my dreams. When self-validation doesn't fully develop, we get to this place that we talked about, that we began with, looking at the symptoms of shame-based trauma. We have reoccurring feelings of self-doubt, chronic inability to maintain feelings of satisfaction and contentment. I call it chronic discontent. It's something feels good for a while, and then it starts to not feel as great, and then we don't like it, and then we move on, and we get on that cycle of where we keep trying new things. So ultimately, you get to a very discouraged place, like why try anything? Because it's all gonna go to not feeling good before long. A wavering, unstable sense of self-purpose and direction. Difficulty in maintaining lifelong primary relationships and or career, feeling as if you are an imposter. When the self can't develop fully, then you begin to feel as if you're acting as if something else. Splitting by being one way in public and significantly different in private. When we can't self-validate and we need to be dependent on the validation of others, when I'm in front of you, I am what you want me to be. And when I'm in front of someone else, I'm what you want me to be. Because I need that validation to be able to contain the shame. And so I move from situation to situation to situation, seeking the validation. And the result is this kind of splitting behavior that we see, where we are one way with one person and another way, can create incredible havoc in relationships. A recurring need to escape pain through addictions. The committee in our heads, I love this analogy because I think it's really relevant here. Without the ability to self-validate, the true voice of the self never develops, and we become a victim to the changing whims of the committee in our heads. It's a great analogy because if you think about when that voice, when that real root, when that solid sense of core doesn't develop in you, you're at a whim to, well, you might do it this way. And then you've got someone over here saying, well, I don't know if I would actually do it that way. It might be misinterpreted. And then you've got the voice over here saying, yeah, but you really need to make money, and this is the way to do it. And you go back and forth. And it's just like a committee. And every one of you in here sat on a committee, right? And the worst thing in the world is to create something by committee. Really. The great mistakes of the world have been created by committee. Truly. It doesn't work. And this is what's going on in our heads and in our clients' heads often, because we don't have that voice. There is no chairperson of the committee. There's no one coming to the board table saying, okay, here's the agenda, here's what we're going to do, here's our long-term objective. Now, let's all organize around that. Now, whenever you've been on a committee or a team or whatever, you've had a manager that's done that, it feels good, it feels containing, and you can actually get somewhere. We need someone to set the stage and to say, this is the path, this is okay, this is how we're going to do it. And yet, for so many of us in our heads, we can't even do it for ourselves because we're caught in the quagmire of these voices across the table in our head. I'd do it this way, or I wouldn't do it that way. Back and forth it goes around without the ability to self-validate. It wasn't until I was in my early 50s that I realized that I'd lived most of my life believing my opinion wasn't as important as some other people's. It served me well in the corporate world. I was always the guy who wouldn't push back, rolled up my sleeves, and got it done. Only thing is, now I don't really know what my opinion is. What do I really care about? Direct quote from a gentleman who had made it to the top of one of the Fortune 100 companies. I haven't a clue about what I'm going to do when I grow up, and I'm more than grown up. It seems like no matter what the job or how good it is at first, it eventually becomes drudgery. How many times do we hear that and see it? What I'd like to do is go into talking about some of the ineffective coping mechanisms that we develop out of shame-based trauma. And the reason why we need to identify these is because it's really helpful when we're working with our clients to be able to identify them as such and to begin to teach better, more effective coping skills that help to replace those that become really ingrained. And what I've called them is deficit defenses. Deficit meaning the self-validation deficit. So the first one I'd like to talk about is overcompensation. I must hide my inadequacy behind a mask of overachievement. It's hiding behind being the best, covering up the shameful self, bigger, better, famous, fabulous, larger than life. When I wrote The Velvet Rage, one of the things that I mentioned in there was that it really is no coincidence that if you look at the top of almost every creative profession or industry, it's run, or near the top of it is a gay man running it. And it doesn't make sense to me to think that a creative gene would necessarily be linked to being gay. So how do we explain this? Is it the fact that many gay men don't have kids and they're able to focus on their career? Perhaps. But I do think that there's something to this overcompensation, which is because I fundamentally believe, because I grew up invalidated, and I fundamentally believe that there's something about me that makes me unlovable, that if I can get to the highest and be the best at it, be bigger, better, more fabulous than everyone else, it will make it okay. And that helps me get through. All right, decompensation. Life is too painful to be experienced directly. Escape the pain of this shameful self. Addictions to drug and alcohol. Retreat into illness. Now, while we wouldn't be so brazen to say that decompensation is the sole cause of addiction, it certainly plays a part in it. And in self-medication, in that aspect, where we're using drugs and alcohol to try to medicate, to try to escape the present reality, when you're hit with that onslaught of shame, and the mechanisms that you've used to defend yourself against it, primarily validation from other people, starts failing you, where you need more and more and it's not coming, or your world begins to fall apart and you're not able to get it, it's a way to escape the pain, to reach down into your addiction and engage in it. If you think about those that have had highly successful careers, the stories are many. You all probably know them as well as I do, of those on Wall Street who have had highly successful careers and then the bottom falls out of it, and what happens? They start drinking and using. That is their defense, and it has failed them. And it is no longer working, and so therefore I need to escape the pain in any way that I can. And there are many ways in which we might choose to escape our pain, not just through drugs and addiction. There are also the process addictions. It was interesting. How many of you heard the news this morning about the SEC? And yeah, isn't that interesting? Fascinating. About high-level, I don't know if they're executives, but they were fairly high. Yeah, attorneys and executives at the SEC making up to $200,000 a year, watching pornography on their computers at work up to 8 hours a day. One of them accessed pornographic sites. Did you remember the figure? It just blew me. 1,800 times, and it was like in 2 days or 3 days. It was crazy. I mean, clearly an addiction. Clearly. It's way beyond anything. It's an escape. Well, that was the point that they were making on Good Morning America as well. Like, do you suppose they were watching porn rather than watching the stock market, or who knows? But if that's the case, but it is the case that it is one of the things that really starts the road of addiction. Which is the defense of overcompensation fails to work, and because the problem with overcompensation is that it always requires more. And it always requires bigger. And you get on that treadmill and it's more and more and more. And clearly, some people are able to pull this off for a lifetime, but not many of us can. And so you find that you reach the point where you're not able to get more, you're not able to keep overcompensating, and then the bottom falls out for you.